Hello listeners, my name is Jane, a volunteer with the National Organization of Victims of Juvenile Murderers. Some of you might know me, as I've been on Roberta Glass's True Crime Report several times. On Roberta's show, I discussed the movement to end life without parole for juvenile criminals. LWOP is a short way of saying life without parole. To summarize, there is a well-funded and powerful movement to end juvenile LWOP. This movement hurts victims by promoting unjust and traumatizing laws and using shameful propaganda. My episodes on Roberta's show will be linked in the description. Here I will explain some recent news regarding juvenile LWOP. In March, New Mexico SB 247 was defeated. The House session ended, and because the bill was not heard, it died. SB 247, which we call the Victim Retraumatization Bill, would have mandated parole hearings for all juvenile criminals after only 15 years. The first version of the bill would have mandated parole hearings after only 10 years. Killers who the bill could have freed include Nathaniel Jouett, who murdered 2 women and injured 4 others during a mass shooting at the Clovis Carver Library, Nehemiah Griego, who murdered his parents, his 9-year-old brother, his 5-year-old sister, and his 2-year-old sister, Darcy Smith, who kidnapped a 17-year-old boy and shot him to death for fun, and John Gamble, who beat a 15-year-old boy to death and torched his body. In Maryland, House Bill 409 and SB 494, collectively known as the Juvenile Restoration Act, passed the House and Senate. Governor Hogan vetoed the bills, but the legislature overrode the vetoes. The legislation, more appropriately titled the Juvenile Revictimization Act, entitles all juvenile criminals to parole eligibility, plus 3 judicial reviews. The judicial reviews are allowed after an offender has served 20 years and are 3 years apart from each other. NOVJM simply wanted the bills to be amended so that victims would endure fewer re-traumatizing hearings. Victims of multiple juveniles would be subjected to intense trauma. For example, police officer Amy Caprio was run over with a Jeep and killed by 4 juveniles. Because of this legislation, her family will relive the murder at 12 resentencing hearings, plus several parole hearings. Other criminals impacted include serial rapist and serial killer Alexander Watson, robber, home invader, murderer Donnell Graham, and arsonist murderer Benjamin Garris. There is pending legislation in several states. In Texas, there are House Bills 686, 2341, and 2177. In Rhode Island, there is SB 333 and HB 50144, which would grant parole hearings for juvenile criminals after only 15 years. In Alaska, SB 114 would also grant parole hearings after only 15 years. The bill could free Winona Fletcher, who, at 14, murdered 3 people during a home invasion robbery. The victims, who were ages 67 to 76, were held hostage at gunpoint and then executed. As one victim begged for her life, Fletcher said, "Shut up, blank," curse word, and shot her in the head at close range to prevent her from identifying her. In Louisiana, there is HB 254, which entitles juvenile killers to parole hearings after 25 years. Several Louisiana murders illustrate why 254 is a bad idea. There's the 1994 murder of 82-year-old Rita Rabalais. During a gang initiation, a group of assailants, 4 of them juveniles, invaded Rita's home to rob her and then murdered her. Rita, who was targeted because she was believed to have a lot of money, was surrounded, grabbed by the hair, and slammed to the ground. The attackers kicked her, beat her, hit her on the head with a pipe, and stabbed her with knives from her kitchen. She was also choked with a wire. The killers then ransacked Rita's home. There is the 1992 kidnapping, robbery, and murder of 18-year-old Louisiana State University freshman Kipp Gullett. Dale Craig, 17, Zebbie Berthelot, 16, James Levine, 19, and Roy Moorer went on a hunt for a car to rob. Craig, who was 1 week away from his 18th birthday, wanted a car to visit his girlfriend. In the parking lot of the Kirby Smith dormitory on LSU's campus, they found Kipp. They kidnapped him at gunpoint and drove him around. As they were driving, Kipp pleaded with his kidnappers. He offered his captors his money and his truck and told them that his parents were rich and would pay for a safe return. He also attempted to keep his face hidden in his hands to convince them that he would not be able to identify them if they were to release him. Craig forced him to sit up straight to look normal. Craig decided to kill Kipp after one co-defendant used an identifying name. The kidnappers drove Kipp to a secluded construction site. Craig and Levine, both of whom had handguns, pulled Kipp from the truck and marched him to a grassy area at gunpoint. Levine used the butt of the gun to strike Kipp in the head, causing him to fall to the ground. Levine began to return to the vehicle. Kipp now lay on the ground, curled up in a fetal position. Craig knelt at his side and shot him 3 times in the head, murdering him execution style. In North Carolina, House Bill 424 would mandate parole hearings for juveniles after only 15 years, with the exception of those who commit first-degree murder. First-degree murder cases, the maximum sentence allowed would be 25 years to life. The bill could free the murderers of 10-year-old Tiffany Long. In 1998, Joseph Jones, 13, his uncle Harold Jones, 16, and Harold's girlfriend, Dorthia Bynum, 17, lured Tiffany to a vacant house where they gang-raped her and then murdered her. Joseph Jones and Bynum beat her on the head with a bed rail, but when that didn't work, Joseph Jones strangled her. The bill could also free Laurence Lovett, who murdered UNC Chapel Hill student body president Eve Carson on March 5, 2008. Eve was only 22. She dedicated her life to helping others. She was a member of the Academic Advising Program, the Athletic Council, the Carolina Leadership Development Board, the Chancellor's Committee for University Teaching Awards, the Chancellor Search Committee, the Committee on Scholarships, Awards, and Student Aid, Phi Beta Kappa, and UNC Chapel Hill's Board of Trustees. She was co-president of the Honors Program Student Executive Board. She was co-chairwoman of UNC's chapter of Nourish International, which was a hunger relief organization. She taught and worked with elementary and middle school students. She also traveled, volunteering as a medical assistant in Ecuador, spending a semester abroad in Havana, Cuba, and working with the U.S. Naval Medical Research Unit in Egypt. Eve expected to graduate from UNC in spring 2008. The political science and biology major had already accepted a job as a management consultant at McKinsey & Company, a prestigious company in D.C. She was particularly interested in scientific policy and aspired to pursue higher education after college, perhaps by attending law school or by studying public health and/or public policy in graduate school. Eve never got the chance to graduate college. She wasn't able to work at McKinsey & Company or pursue higher education. She was unable to achieve these aspirations not because of a failure to work hard or be proactive. These opportunities were stolen from her by two men with a .25 caliber handgun and a 12-gauge sawed-off shotgun. The men who obliterated Eve's hopes and dreams were Laurence Lovett, 17, and Demario Atwater, 21. They abducted her at gunpoint. Lovett drove Eve's car while Atwater held a gun to Eve's head in the back. They took her to ATMs and robbed her. As Eve was being held hostage and terrorized at gunpoint in her own car, she repeatedly begged for mercy. She tried to reason with her captors, telling them that they did not have to commit these crimes. Eve begged for her life. She told her captors that they could take whatever they wanted and that they didn't need to kill her. But the kidnappers showed no mercy. In order to silence Eve and escape apprehension, the armed kidnappers took her to a densely wooded neighborhood about a mile from UNC to murder her. When Eve realized that Atwater and Lovett were about to kill her, she tried again to reason with them. The last words she ever spoke in a desperate attempt to receive mercy are haunting. "Pray with me." The end for Eve came anyways. Lovett shot Eve 4 times with a .25 caliber handgun, but Eve managed to survive the bullets, one of which pierced her cheek. After failing to kill Eve with the .25 caliber handgun, it was time for the kidnappers to use the 12-gauge sawed-off shotgun. Atwater aimed it at her right temple. Eve, having endured several bullet wounds, attempted to shield herself with her right hand. The last thing Eve saw in her 22-year life was a barrel of a 12-gauge sawed-off shotgun being aimed by a man who wanted to kill her. Atwater shot Eve. This time, Atwater and Lovett got what they wanted, Eve's death. A forensic psychologist and criminal profiler stated that the manner in which Eve was shot showed a complete lack of regard for another person. The assailants callously left Eve's bullet-ridden body in the middle of the road and fled. The murder of Eve Carson tears apart all the myths about juvenile criminals. We are told that all juvenile criminals are impulsive and immature, or impacted by peer pressure, and fail to appreciate consequences. The truth is that these traits are not involved in all juvenile crimes. Laurence Lovett's execution-style murder of Eve was not impulsive. It was extensively planned ahead of time. Lovett was not under peer pressure. As noted by the North Carolina Court of Appeals in a decision affirming Lovett's sentence, he appears to have led his older co-defendant through the commission of the crimes. Lovett also did not fail to appreciate the consequences of his crimes. At 17, he completely understood how kidnapping and terrorizing Eve caused her to suffer severe mental anguish, and he completely understood that by shooting her 5 times, including in the head, she would die. In fact, the motive for Eve's murder shows that consequences were considered. Atwater and Lovett knew that a consequence of kidnapping and robbing Eve was having her tell others about the crimes, identify them to police, and testify at trial. So they prevented those consequences by murdering her and eliminating her as a witness. It would be absurd to reduce Lovett's sentence due to the traits common to others in his age group. And finally, some good news. In Jones v. Mississippi, the Supreme Court upheld the constitutionality of juvenile LWOP. In short, they ruled that a sentencing authority does not have to make a factual finding that a juvenile killer is permanently incorrigible before sentencing them to LWOP. The petitioner was Bertis Jones. When Jones was 15, he murdered his grandfather Bertis Jones by stabbing him to death. He was sentenced to LWOP. After SCOTUS banned mandatory juvenile LWOP in Miller v. Alabama, the Mississippi Supreme Court vacated and set aside Jones's sentence and remanded the case for a new sentencing hearing consistent with Miller. Now, I will emphasize that the Miller decision allows juvenile LWOP. It just requires that a sentencing authority consider youth and mitigating factors before imposing LWOP upon a juvenile. At Jones's resentencing hearing in the Circuit Court of Lee County, the judge considered his youth and again sentenced him to LWOP. Jones appealed and the case went all the way to SCOTUS. Jones argued that his LWOP sentence was unconstitutional because he was not permanently incorrigible. He argued that before sentencing a juvenile to LWOP, the sentencer should make a factual finding of permanent incorrigibility or at least provide an on-the-record sentencing explanation that implies such a finding. SCOTUS rejected this argument and ruled that a sentencer is only required to consider a juvenile murderer's youth before sentencing them to LWOP. Brett Kavanaugh wrote the majority opinion. In the syllabus, he wrote, quote, "In the case of a defendant who committed a homicide when he or she was under 18, Miller and Montgomery do not require the sentencer to make a separate factual finding of permanent incorrigibility before sentencing the defendant to life without parole. In such a case, a discretionary sentencing system is both constitutionally necessary and constitutionally sufficient. This decision has saved many victims from traumatizing resentencing hearings to determine incorrigibility and from parole hearings. NOVJM filed an amicus brief with SCOTUS explaining the trauma victims endure at such hearings. I wonder if our brief impacted the decision. I hope it did. Thank you for listening.